Hello, I'm Sonia Gill, Director at Heads Up, and with me is...
Clare Fowler, Senior Solicitor at Yes Law.
And we've come together today to have a conversation about neurodiversity in the workplace. And I think this is a good moment just to let Clare chime in with all the legal, non-legal aspects of the conversation we're going to have. Do you want to kind of share something around that for us, Clare?
Of course. So this is the conversation between Sonia and I. The idea behind it is to raise some of the issues that can come up when considering neurodiversity at work. It's not legal advice. It's not directed at any specific situation that you may be in. And if you are trying to manage a situation at work where you think there may be a neurodiversity aspect to it, then I would obviously recommend that you take specific legal advice on that situation if you think that's appropriate. But hopefully the idea is that this will be helpful to kind of introduce some of the issues and some things that you might want to think about when you're managing your staff.
Yeah, thanks, Clare. And I think, I know, so Clare is also an employment solicitor, and in my work with Heads Up, we help schools become genuinely outstanding. But a key part of that is, how do you have those conversations about issues that have arisen that actually you want to get back on track? And I think our work comes together, Clare, very much from a perspective of trying to get those issues that inevitably come up when people come together, work in the workplace, the work that we're doing, working relationship, trying to get them back on track in the best interest for all. And obviously neurodiversity has come to the fore, which is, I would say, argue a good thing, but it does present further issues that people need to think about in those situations.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, we're not trying to scare anybody here. What we're trying to do is acknowledge something that is becoming a more well-known issue, and just encourage people that no one's going to thank you for brushing issues under the carpet, but there are good ways of having difficult conversations, and just having a bit of background to sort of understand where you're coming from is a good way to approach them.
Yeah, really nice. So I guess let's talk about, okay, what do we mean by neurodiversity? And I guess I'm going to say, what do we mean by neurodiversity today? Because I'm sure this definition will change over time, or understanding, but what do we mean by it?
So my own understanding of it is that we're talking about variations in the human brain and cognition, the way we think about and process information and experiences. And that can be expressed in different learning styles, maybe different attention spans, different ways of interacting with other people. And it's often used to describe a range of diagnoses such as autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, as opposed to what might be considered neurotypical brains, which function and process information in the way that society seems to expect.
Nice, there's quite a lot in there, isn't there?
Lots to unpack.
Yeah, lots to unpack, and I'm sure we said that a lot of those terms will end up being unpacked over time in different ways, and in the way that we've got to here. And I guess thinking about the context of the workplace, in employers and employees, what does this mean for them? Particularly there's, if someone has neurodiversity, is neurodiverse, I should say, and there is an issue in their work, how does that change things, not change things? Can we just explore that a little bit? I realize there'll be a lot there, but
yeah, well, I mean, let's make a start. I think the context for all this is that although there might be sort of strong feelings within different groups about any kind of label, in general, as a society, we're being encouraged to kind of accept that neurodiversity is just representative of normal variations in the way our brains work, and to recognise that the way we operate as a society can sometimes put additional barriers in place for people who are neurodivergent. So that's no different in an employment context. And I think the key things are that employers should be aware that neurodiversity exists, should be aware that that can mean barriers for some people, for some of their staff, and also should think about what additional benefits neurodiversity could bring to a workplace in terms of creativity, different ways of approaching things, and looking at the world. So it's not just about problems, it can be about positive things as well. And in terms of where to start, I think employers should be making conscious decisions to actually review their workplace practices to consider how suitable they are, bearing in mind what we know about neurodiversity now, and also whether there are any unintended consequences of just carrying on doing things in the way we always have. And ideally, this will involve a consultation with staff, hopefully all staff, not just people who may consider themselves to be neurodivergent. And given that some estimates are that 15% of people in the general population are neurodivergent, you know, that's going to be potentially quite a large proportion of your staff cohort.
Interesting. Could you give an example of what an adjustment might be? Because obviously you listed quite a few different, you know, examples of how neurodiversity might show up. So one, maybe two that could be really tangible to help us understand what those adjustments might look like.
Of course. So one thing that it might be worth thinking about is how you present information to people. We'll all probably be familiar, for example, with a staff handbook, which is about 50 pages of closely typed text that nobody ever reads from beginning to end, except possibly a very sad employment lawyer, such as myself. But that actually might be really difficult for some people to access if they find reading sort of quickly quite challenging, or if they are just a more visual thinker. So it's potentially worth thinking about right from the start, you know, inducting employees, whether there are other ways of presenting information for them, using graphics and diagrams, flowcharts, that kind of thing, instead of just dense bodies of text. And particularly when you're working in a teaching and learning environment, I think that's probably the sort of thing that you're going to be thinking about for your students, you know, different ways of learning and accessing information. So, you know, why not embody that and think about it in relation to your staff as well?
Yeah, I think there are two thoughts there. So one, yeah, the employee handbook, 50-page of dense text. I think just changing that's a win for everyone.
Exactly.
I don't think anyone would be disappointed in that change. But I love your analogy there with the classroom, because, you know, when we're working with school leads, so on, I bring most of the work we do as leaders working with adults down to how we work with our pupils in class. And exactly say, we wouldn't think twice about making adjustments in the classroom. It's getting our head into that space for the diversity in our adult population, isn't it?
That's right. And I think it can be, you know, really empowering for those staff and help them to feel safer in the working environment. But I think it's also a great example for students. I mean, another thing is to think about, although space is often an issue in schools, you know, you may well have a quiet or sensory room for your students if they are having a difficult day. What about seeing if you could provide something like that for members of staff as well, you know, who just need a bit of a break from the kind of sensory overload of being in such a demanding environment all day. And again, you know, that isn't necessarily just a win for neurodivergent people. Anybody might need that if they're having a difficult day.
Yeah, it's funny as you're saying these things, I'm just thinking that's just a win for everyone. You know, your point about actually diversity, you know, it brings its own gifts, doesn't it? And I know not just in these ways, and I guess we all get to benefit, but it's another example of actually there's just some really great practice being talked about here, where it is viable, obviously, like I say, space isn't always possible.
Yeah.
So let's talk about then, you know, when there is a difficult issue, because I think you're absolutely right. Let's, you know, our range of experiences and you know, how we work is a wonderful thing in schools. But one thing I've come across, and I don't know the answers, one thing I've come across when working with schools when they're having their difficult conversations, and they're absolutely coming from a place, as you and I are, of we want to get this on track. We want this person to be successful in school for themselves, for the pupils, for everyone, but we're not where we need to be. You know, what are the parameters for handling those issues when someone is neurodiverse? You know, does anything change? What adjustments do we make or don't we make? How does that work from your understanding as an employment solicitor?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is, particularly in employment law, there's rarely one right answer. And especially in this kind of scenario, everybody's different, and people will have different needs. And sometimes that's really challenging as a line manager, because there is no one correct way to manage all the different people that you're responsible for. So I'm afraid I can't give you an easy kind of tick box answer. But as with any sort of difficult conversation, or any conversation at all, really, I think it's very key to start early. Don't let a situation get intractable and out of control before you start to tackle it. And ask yourself a lot of questions before you go anywhere near having a conversation with the person that you may be concerned about. You know, can you state clearly to yourself what the issue is, why it's an issue, and what improvement is needed? Are you absolutely confident that the standard of performance or conduct that you're requiring has been clearly communicated to the person involved? Do you think that person has understood your communication, even if you think it's been clear? Have they had sufficient training? You know, I guess, do any of the things that are contributing to the problem suggest that neurodivergence could be a factor? You know, does it involve poor organisation? Does it involve tasks taking too long? Does it involve perhaps difficult social interactions? And if you think that there's more that you could be doing in relation to any of those things, do that first and then have the conversation if it's still not resolved.
Yeah. I mean, these are just great principles, aren't they, for any difficult conversation, regardless. Although you might have noticed my shocks there when you said there's no straightforward answer. There never is. There's never a straightforward one answer.
No.
Okay, so imagine we do that. I guess, you know, I've kind of, you know, I've got this situation. I'm aware someone, you know, is neurodiverse. I've tried to, you know, we've tried to put in place things to help, things to support, make sure it's clear, you know, I try to do all the things that you've talked about to the best of our ability, whether, you know, getting outside help or resources or however, but actually the problem still remains.
Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, once you've done all those things and you're satisfied that you have, at the end of the day, you're paying someone to do a job, and you can expect them to do it. So you can still manage performance or misconduct. And really, you do it in the same kind of way as you would for anybody, but just taking into account the extra things that somebody might need. So, you know, I suppose the other thing is you can't force somebody to tell you about any medical condition or any sort of neurodivergence. So you do have to approach it quite sensitively. But, you know, you can talk about general strategies that might help. But yes, if you've still got an issue after all that, then you may have to go through a formal process of performance management or a disciplinary process even. And then you're at a situation of just thinking, what adjustments might you need to make to that process, which may include things like providing somebody with the questions that you need to ask them in advance so that they've got time to think about them. You may want to think about inviting someone who you perhaps wouldn't normally allow to accompany someone in a meeting in. So the legal requirement is that somebody is accompanied in a formal meeting by a colleague, a work colleague, or a trade union representative. But if you know that someone's going to struggle, you could perhaps allow them to bring a family member or a friend, somebody else who knows how their condition works and how it affects them and is able to provide that kind of extra level of support. You might want to allow somebody with who finds it difficult with their short-term memory to record a meeting, even if you wouldn't normally allow that, so that they can then go back and kind of reflect on the points that were made afterwards. So, and then I think it's really important, whatever the outcome of the meeting, to ensure good follow-up and support for everyone that's been involved in the situation, just to kind of promote good relationships going forward, and keep talking, basically.
It's interesting listening to you talk. It makes me think of the phrase we use in schools about removing barriers to learning. And actually, it feels like what we're doing there is removing barriers to this person being able to fully engage in the process. And that might include doing some things that wouldn't be standard practice, like you say, recording the conversation. Really interesting. What about when it's a conduct issue specifically? And I ask this because, you know, I've been presented with some scenarios, and I always point to legal advice because I'm not legal advice, but some scenarios where one of the challenges of the particular, you know, type of neurodiversity someone has is how it manifests in their conduct, and how that, obviously they display behaviours, but then that affects the wider team as well, and the tensions that brings in. And obviously if someone wasn't suspected or known to be neurodiverse, that would be a case of, okay, there's a conduct issue that may end up becoming a more formal issue. how does neurodiversity change that?
I mean, I think it's important to ensure that all staff, and hopefully in a school setting this would be the case anyway, are have a good level of awareness of neurodiversity and how it might impact on people's behaviour, but also how the workplace environment might put extra stress and pressure on them. I think it's worth looking at whether there's a pattern to when it's quite often this kind of issue is about conflict between colleagues. So it might be important to have a look at whether there's a pattern to when that happens. Is it generally at the end of a long day, or, you know, when something particular has happened, perhaps, you know, that's led to sort of overload or someone feeling overstimulated? Is it, the other thing is, I think it's really important to weigh both sides in the balance here. So somebody might be very sympathetic to neurodivergence, but still really struggle with how the manifestation of that by someone else is impacting on them. And I think it's really important to be brave enough to discuss what it is about the person's behaviour that's proving difficult and why, and perhaps the impact that's having on other people, and have a conversation about how it could be moderated. You know, again, you may already have tried all these things prior to there being a formal process. And if those things haven't worked when appropriate support's in place, then you do follow a formal process as you would for anyone else, because of that balance. You know, you can't just say, well, you know, perhaps you can't help it, so we'll just let it go. I mean, that's not acceptable in a workplace, because you're dealing with lots of different people.
Yeah. It sounds like at every opportunity you're trying to find ways to get this back on track, and that it might take a little bit longer in the case where neurodiversity is present. Is that fair to say? I mean, I know how long's a piece of string, you know, it's not necessarily the case, but actually you just might, there are other approaches that you might need to bring in.
Yes, I mean, I think it's, you know, it's all about empathy and treating someone as you would want to be treated. You know, in both the sort of the perpetrator, if you like, and the victim of the behaviour, but just trying to mediate between them in some ways, and see whether it's possible to restore that relationship, and have a think about whether there's something that you as the employer could be doing that would help that. In some cases that's not possible, and other steps have to be taken that perhaps nobody really wants to take. But as an employer, in terms of legal liability, the key thing is to demonstrate that you've really thought about all of these issues, and you can explain how you got to the point that you got to, because, you know, if you're kind of not sure about that and you wonder how it all got this far, the chances are you're not going to be able to explain that very well if you're ever challenged about it. So I think it's about actively considering all the way through any kind of performance or conduct management process, you know, why you're taking the steps you're taking, and what you've done to support to try and avoid having to go there, really.
And I guess within that, even considering alternative roles that might be better suited to someone's, you know, and actually maybe, you know, even really celebrate and make great use of the differences that exist.
Yes, I mean, I think that there's a real tendency, because it's easier to say, well, this is the job description for your role, you've got to do all of that and you've got to do it all well. Whereas, you know, we all know that there are some things that we're better or more confident at than others. And if there is the opportunity to maybe mix and match a little bit so people can support each other, you know, somebody can take more of the thing that they're great at and get rid of some of the stuff that they don't enjoy so much, you know, that's fantastic. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work like that, but it's worth thinking about.
Yeah, I've seen a few examples in my years of where, not necessarily in the situation of neurodiversity, but where actually people have come back from the brink of dismissal to do a job that they flourish in, because we've realised what are they great at and how can they, you know, and actually it's been a completely different trajectory, which is nice. On the occasion it can happen.
Yeah.
So you've touched on this slightly, but one last thing I'd like to touch base with is, what if, you know, someone hasn't shared a diagnosis, or they perhaps haven't got one, but perhaps people suspect someone may have, you know, maybe is neurodiverse. What happens then when dealing with conduct and performance?
I mean, I think this comes back to sort of treating people as you'd like to be treated, really. From a legal perspective, there's no need for a particular diagnosis for somebody to be protected by the Equality Act. So the definition of disability there, and I recognise that a lot of neurodivergent people would not consider themselves to be disabled, and that's fine. I'm just talking about a legal label here. But the definition of disability is somebody who has a physical or mental impairment that has a long-term, which means lasting or likely to last 12 months or more, condition that has a substantial adverse impact on their day-to-day activities. So whether or not someone's disclosed a condition to you, if you think that might be a factor, my advice would always be treat it as if that is in play. And as we've discussed, a lot of the reasonable adjustments that you might make for somebody will benefit everybody. So it's just about having a think about, you know, your wider practice, I suppose, in terms of having conversations and so on, and making them as accessible as possible for everybody based on what you do know about them.
That's really useful. And it's making me think that in a way, regardless of having, you know, being neurodiverse or not, I think the common theme that comes up time and time again, Claire, from you is, what can you do to help this person succeed in a role they've got? Work towards that goal with all the kindness and sympathy you can, but realise there is also a line where perhaps it just isn't working, and perhaps having too big a negative impact elsewhere. I think that's always the hard thing, particularly in schools, because, you know, you've got people who care about their nurturing environments, and we've got pupils who are perhaps not getting the best, you know, the best deal that they can. So, you know, it's a tough landscape to navigate, but do as much as you reasonably can to support that person to succeed. And if that doesn't work out, then unfortunately we're going to end up in those more formal processes. Is that kind of a trying to pull it together? Does that work?
Yeah, I think it's less about, you know, labeling individual people with as one thing or another, and more about supporting everybody. And I just have to get a little plug in here as a lawyer. Just keep track of what you're doing. Just make a record, follow things up, make notes, because that will help.
That's a very good plug as a lawyer. Definitely. I think it also just helps yourself. I think a lot of it, and I see this with school leaders when I work with them, you know, that doubt of, have we done enough? Is there more we could do? And I think actually just seem to go yourself, actually, this has been going on for 18 months now, and we've tried it. It's like, at that point, you probably have, you know, the list of actions over that period of time, if anything, might be argued that it's taken too long, which I'd say is better than too short, but still, as well as the legal, you know, the legal kind of, from a legal perspective, being able to show what you've done by keeping a record.
Yeah, and we all know time flies. It's very easy to lose track of how long you have been managing something. Yeah,
definitely. Fantastic. Claire, I found that really useful, as always, whenever I speak to you. Is there anything else you'd like to add, you know, to the conversation we've had around neurodiversity?
No, I think just, you know, don't be scared about it. If you are, you know, if you do have concerns, there are loads and loads of resources that are available for employers. You know, there are loads of ways to educate yourself so that you feel more confident about what you're dealing with. Equality and Human Rights Commission website is fantastic. They have lots of guides and kind of examples and things for employers, but there are loads of other organisations who you can work with, or who you can, you know, whose websites you can read to kind of get a feel for where you might need to go with this.
Amazing. Thanks, Claire. And I'm going to put a plug, because if you enjoyed listening to the wisdom of Claire, which I always enjoy listening to, then Claire's going to be at our capability conference in March. I'll put the link with this video. She's going to be talking about actually how you navigate the landscape of managing performance, hopefully getting people back on track. I'm also going to be talking about how to have those difficult conversations successfully. So hopefully we never need to get into the formal procedures. And yeah, we'd love to see you there. If you can come along, join us in March. It's a really good day. And it's funny, Claire, I've heard you talk on this topic quite a few times, and I never get bored of hearing you talk, because you articulate it so well and provide such insight and clarity. It's just brilliant. So yeah, if you'd like to see Claire again, and maybe me, then join us in March. Thanks, Claire. Thank you for today.
Thanks for inviting me.
Pleasure. See you soon.